there is a very specific kind of light. You know it when you see it. It's soft, it's a little blurry, and it comes through a wall made entirely of glass ice cubes. If you grew up literally anywhere in America between, let's say, 1988 and 2001, doesn't matter if you were in Miami or Minneapolis or a landlocked suburb of Ohio that had never seen an ocean in its life, you knew this light. It came through the wall of your aunt's master bathroom shower. It came through the little decorative window next to your neighbor's front door. It came through the atrium of your local Bally Total Fitness. And it almost always showed up with friends. Flamingo pink, seafoam or mint green, a white ceramic tile grid running along the floor like a chessboard designed by a dolphin, teal, peach, the occasional touch of gold-toned brass hardware, because subtlety was, frankly, not the assignment. Today we are going to ask a genuinely weird question. How did a design language that was born in one specific neighborhood, in one specific city, for very specific historical reasons, end up in your grandma's bathroom in Cleveland? Because that's really what happened. This wasn't just a trend. This was a hyper-local aesthetic, built out of Art Deco hotels, hurricane codes, and a TV show about cocaine, that got copy-pasted onto strip malls and starter homes across an entire continent. And then, just as fast as it arrived, we collectively decided it was the most embarrassing thing a house could possibly look like, which, considering what replaced it, an entire nation agreeing to live inside the same 3 shades of gray, is a choice we should probably talk about too. So here's where we're going. We're going to start in the 1920s and 30s because, plot twist, glass block wasn't invented to look cute. It was invented to solve a problem. Then we're going to talk about how a failing, half-abandoned retirement town got rebranded by a TV show about a Ferrari and a pet alligator. Then we'll watch that aesthetic escape Florida entirely and colonize the American suburbs. And finally, we'll talk about why we all turned on it, and why right now, in your algorithm, it is quietly making a comeback. Grab a Crystal Pepsi, or, a LaCroix, since that's what we drink now. Let's get into it. To understand a Florida room with a glass block shower, you have to go back almost a century, to a very different Miami beach, one that had absolutely nothing to do with pastel colors yet. In the 1920s, Florida had a real estate boom, and then, brutally, a bust. A hurricane in 1926 followed by the Great Depression pretty much flattened the party. But out of that economic wreckage came something unexpected, a wave of cheap land and cheaper construction budgets, right as a new architectural style was sweeping the world. That style was streamline moderne, a softer, curvier cousin of Art Deco, inspired by ocean liners, airplanes, and the general fantasy that the future was going to be smooth, fast, and aerodynamic. You see it in the rounded corners of those Ocean Drive hotels, the little porthole windows, the horizontal racing stripes called eyebrows that shaded the windows from the brutal Florida sun. And it's in these buildings, built cheap, built fast, in the late 1930s, that our main character makes its first appearance. Glass block. Glass block as a building material wasn't a Florida invention. It had been patented and refined in Europe and the US throughout the early 20th century, largely for industrial buildings, factories that needed daylight on the work floor without the fragility or the price tag of huge plate glass windows. But in Miami, glass block found its perfect job. 3, actually. 1. Light without heat stroke. Miami's sun is aggressive. A regular window lets in glare and heat along with the light. Glass block diffuses it. You get illumination without the visual and thermal assault of direct sun. 2. Privacy. This is the one people forget. A glass block wall lets a bathroom, a stairwell, or a hallway Get natural light while staying completely opaque to anyone trying to look in. You get the physics of an open window with the modesty of a solid wall. And 3, and this is the big one for Florida specifically, durability. Glass block is basically small, thick, hollow core glass units, mortared together like bricks. That structure is naturally resistant to humidity, salt air, and this matters a lot in a hurricane zone. Wind-borne debris, far more than a single sheet of plate glass. So, before it was ever a style, glass block was a genuinely smart, climate-adapted engineering choice for a subtropical hurricane-prone coastline. That's important, because it means this aesthetic had actual structural DNA underneath it. It wasn't decoration for decoration's sake. At least, not at first. Now, fast forward about 50 years. Because glass block goes quiet for a while. It becomes just a normal, slightly old-fashioned material, used in basements and factories. Until the 1980s handed back its style card, care of a movement that was actively trying to make architecture fun again. In 1981, in Milan, a designer named Ettore Sottsass founded a collective called the Memphis Group, and what they made was, deliberately, a middle finger to the design establishment, because up to that point, the dominant taste in serious design, modernism, had been all about restraint. Function follows form. Less is more. A chair should look like a chair, and not say, feel like a cartoon character. Sottsass and the Memphis Group looked at that entire rule book and said, what if furniture could just be a little unhinged? Bright plastic laminates, confetti patterns, squiggles, colors that had no business being next to each other. Dusty pink next to acid yellow next to teal, all slammed together on furniture that looked like it belonged in a cartoon, not a living room. This was part of a much bigger cultural shift called postmodernism. And I want to be careful here, because postmodern is one of those words that gets thrown around a lot and means slightly different things depending on who's using it. In architecture specifically, it meant a rejection of the cold, glassbox seriousness of mid-century modernism in favor of buildings that could reference history, use ornament again, and, crucially, be a little bit ironic, even playful. The American architect most associated with bringing that sensibility into the mainstream was Michael Graves. His Portland building, completed in 1982, shocked the architecture world. It used pastel-adjacent colors, oversized decorative details, and classical references on a government office building of all things. A few years later, he designed the Team Disney headquarters in Burbank, literally holding up its roof with giant sculptures of the Seven Dwarfs. The point is, by the mid-1980s, serious design had officially given itself permission to be colorful, decorative, and a little goofy again. Pastels weren't just for Easter eggs anymore. Geometric shapes could be playful instead of purely structural. And that permission slip is what's about to collide, at exactly the right moment, with a city that desperately needed a new image. Here's something that might surprise you if all you know of Miami is influencers on South Beach. By the early 1980s, Miami Beach was, frankly, dying. The glamorous Art Deco hotels we just talked about. By this point, most of them were run down. Cheap retirement housing for elderly residents on fixed incomes. The neighborhood had a reputation, deserved or not, as a haven for crime, drugs, and general urban decay. Developers weren't interested in restoring those old hotels. They wanted to bulldoze them and put up generic high-rises. Into this exact moment steps a woman named Barbara Capitman. Capitman was a design writer and preservationist who looked at those crumbling Deco hotels and saw not blight, but an irreplaceable architectural treasure, one of the largest concentrations of Art Deco buildings in the world. In 1976, she co-founded the Miami Design Preservation League, and she spent years fighting, building by building, to get this district legally protected. In 1979, her efforts helped get the Miami Beach Architectural District listed on the National Register of Historic Places, one of the first 20th century districts to receive that status. That was the legal win. But a legal designation doesn't automatically make people love a building. Capitman understood something else too. These buildings needed a new visual identity people could fall in love with. And this is where the color comes in. Because here's a detail that gets left out of a lot of the shorter versions of this story. Most of those original 1930s Deco buildings weren't pastel. They were often white or cream, sometimes with much more muted, subtle color accents. The vivid pastel color schemes we associate with Miami Deco today, hot pink, turquoise, mint, lavender, were largely a reinterpretation applied in the 1980s, championed by designers and preservationists working alongside Capitman, most notably a designer named Leonard Horowitz, who developed a specific pastel palette intended to make the architectural details, the eyebrows, the stepped facades, the porthole windows, pop and read clearly, even from a moving car, or, just as importantly, on camera. Because that's the second half of this story, and it's the part that turns a local preservation win into a global aesthetic. In 1984, a television show premieres that is going to need a backdrop, and Miami, repainted, reframed, and desperate for a new reputation, is about to audition for the role of a lifetime. Miami Vice ran on NBC from 1984 to 1989, and if you've never watched it, the plot, two Vice detectives going undercover to bust drug cartels, is honestly not the point. The point is the look. The show's creators made a decision that at the time was genuinely radical for network television. No earth tones. There was reportedly an internal rule, sometimes summarized as no browns. A deliberate ban on the muddy, brown and beige color palette that dominated cop shows, and frankly, most of American television up to that point. Instead, Miami Vice was shot in pastels and jewel tones. The detectives wore linen suits in mint and salmon over pastel t-shirts. No socks, sleeves pushed up. The cinematography leaned hard into golden hour light, neon reflections on rain-slicked streets, and constantly, in the background of almost every establishing shot, those repainted Art Deco hotels on Ocean Drive. So you had two things happening at exactly the same time, feeding each other. Preservationists were repainting a historic district in bold pastels to save it from demolition, and a hit television show was filming right there, broadcasting that exact color palette into tens of millions of homes every single week for 5 straight years. It's genuinely hard to overstate how much this rebranded the city. Before Miami Vice, the popular image of Miami, thanks in part to real serious crime waves in the early 80s and a wave of unflattering national news coverage, was something closer to retirement community with a drug problem. After Miami Vice, Miami was cool, Miami was fashion, Miami was a Ferrari Testarossa at sunset. And crucially, this is the mechanism that makes the rest of this video make sense. Television doesn't just show you a place, it teaches you what stylish looks like. And for about 5 years, stylish had a very specific, very learnable formula. Pastel color, white or cream trim, curved architectural lines, and glass block catching the light in the background. And notice, glass block is right there too, doing exactly the job it was originally designed for, filtering moody, diffused light through nightclub and apartment sets, giving that glow that made every interior look like it belonged on a magazine cover. So, by the time Miami Vice goes off the air in 1989, you have an entire visual language: pastel plus glass block plus clean geometric white trim. that is now firmly, unshakably associated in the American mind with current, upscale, and cool, and a visual language that popular doesn't stay confined to one zip code for long. Okay, so we've established the source code. Deco architecture, hurricane-proof functional glass block, Memphis group pastels, and 5 years of Miami Vice, beaming that combination into every living room in America. Now we get to the actual question in the title. How does that specific, geographically rooted aesthetic end up in a builder-grade colonial in the Ohio suburbs? The short answer is, home builders and remodelers are essentially professional trend followers. The housing industry, especially the mass-market suburban tract home and remodeling industry, doesn't invent taste. It watches what reads as aspirational in media and popular culture, and it packages a version of that for the broadest possible audience as fast as it can. And by the late 1980s, Miami cool was one of the most bankable aesthetics in the country. So builders' pattern books, kitchen and bath showrooms, and home magazines started translating it, not as full Art Deco architecture, which is expensive and specific, but as a kit of easily reproducible parts. Let's build one of these houses together, piece by piece, because the pattern really is remarkably consistent, no matter where in the country you find it. Start with the primary bathroom. This is glass block's flagship residential role in the 90s. A curved glass block wall, usually enclosing a walk-in shower or wrapping around a garden-soaking tub, letting light in from a window or skylight beyond it, while keeping the whole fixture private from the rest of the room. It photographed beautifully in real estate listings and builder brochures, and, genuinely, it did the job it was invented to do: diffuse light, keep privacy, resist moisture. It was a perfect functional match for a bathroom, which is exactly why it spread so fast. It wasn't purely decorative excess. It was a legitimately smart material finding its ideal application at scale. Next, the kitchen. White ceramic subway or square tile as the base, clean, cheap to produce at scale, easy to keep looking fresh, accented with a border or inset stripe of color. Peach was huge. Dusty rose, seafoam, sometimes a teal, and notice the material logic repeating itself. Tile, like glass block, is chosen partly because it's practical in a kitchen, water-resistant, easy to wipe down, and partly because it lets you introduce color cheaply, in small, controllable doses, without repainting an entire room. And then it leaves the house entirely and colonizes commercial architecture. Strip malls in the late 80s and 90s got a very recognizable facelift. Teal awnings, hot pink accent stripes, curved corner entrances with, again, glass block windows, nail salons, tanning salons, hair salons, video rental stores, ice cream shops, fast casual restaurants. This was the default modern retail look for an entire decade. It said clean, new, fun, in a visual shorthand that any strip mall developer could order out of a catalog. And I think this comparison is really the crux of the whole video. What you're looking at, side by side, is the exact same design vocabulary. Pastel color blocking, glass block, curved white architectural trim, applied first to a landmark hotel restoration project led by design historians, and a few years later to a strip mall nail salon in a state that has never once seen a hurricane. The aesthetic got completely divorced from its original context. The why disappeared, and only the what survived. There's actually a name for this kind of process in design history. It's sometimes called trickle-down style diffusion, though scholars argue about exactly how top-down or bottom-up the flow really is in any given era. But the basic mechanism here is clear. An elite or niche design movement, Memphis group furniture, avant-garde postmodern architecture, a boutique historic preservation project, gets picked up by mass media gets simplified into its most recognizable, easy-to-manufacture visual traits, and gets sold to the widest possible market at the lowest possible price point. And it's worth saying, this wasn't a conspiracy. It was just how the home goods industry worked, and honestly still works. Paint companies release seasonal palettes. Tile manufacturers produce what showrooms think will sell. Home builders offer a menu of finished packages to buyers who, quite reasonably, just want their new house to look current. By 1991 or so, current meant Miami. So that's what got built. From Seattle to St. Louis to a cul-de-sac 20 minutes from wherever you grew up. By the time you get to the mid-90s, this style has been so thoroughly mass-produced that most people encountering it had absolutely no idea it originated in a preservation battle over Art Deco hotels in South Florida. It was just what a bathroom looked like. It was just what nice houses looked like. The history had been completely sanded off, leaving only the shapes and the colors behind. So here's the part of the story that anyone who lived through it already knows in their bones. By the early 2000s, this look had gone from aspirational to instant punchline in what felt like about 18 months. There are a few overlapping reasons for this, and it's worth taking them one at a time, because I think we just got bored of it is true but slightly too simple. Reason one is the most straightforward: oversaturation. When a style becomes the unavoidable default, when literally every strip mall, every dentist's waiting room, every starter home bathroom looks the same, it stops reading as stylish and starts reading as generic. Ubiquity kills specialness. The whole appeal of the original Miami Deco palette was that it made those buildings stand out. Once every Supercuts in America had a teal awning, standing out was no longer on the table. Reason two: a lot of the mass-market execution of this style was, frankly, cheap. Original Art Deco glass blockwork, and even the higher-end 90s residential installations, used quality material and skilled installation. But as demand exploded, you got a flood of lower-cost imitation. Thin vinyl-look tile in peach, cheaply mass-produced glass block panels, laminate instead of real material. The version most people actually lived with was a discount copy of a copy, and it tended to age badly. Grout discoloring, plasticky finishes looking dated fast, in a way that higher quality materials wouldn't have. Reason three is the big cultural one. Taste is cyclical, and it tends to swing hard in the opposite direction, from whatever just overstayed its welcome. As the 90s pastel and glass block look started to feel dated and a little tacky, the design world swung hard toward minimalism. Stainless steel appliances, granite countertops, neutral grayish wall colors, travertine instead of colored ceramic tile, clean lines instead of curves. It was, in a lot of ways, a direct rejection of everything the 90s look stood for. Color, ornament, playfulness, all traded in for restraint and timelessness. And there's a real irony buried in that word timelessness, because the neutral, gray, stainless steel look that replaced Miami pastels in the 2000s and 2010s has, itself, aged into a very recognizable, very dateable style. Nothing is actually timeless. Every neutral, safe choice is just the specific aesthetic fingerprint of its own decade, waiting to be recognized as such in about 20 years. And that brings us to reason four, which is really more of a general law of pop culture than a Miami-specific one. There's a well-documented pattern where a decade's aesthetic becomes deeply uncool roughly 10 to 20 years after its peak, right as the generation that grew up surrounded by it becomes old enough to find it embarrassing and closely associated with their parents, and then swings back around into genuine, often ironic then sincere nostalgia about 10 to 20 years after that. The 90s Miami look followed that pattern almost exactly. peak popularity in the late 80s through mid-90s, deep uncoolness through the 2000s and into the 2010s, when it was pure punchline material. Ugly 90s bathroom became its own meme category, and now, right on schedule, it's back. And if you've spent any time on Pinterest, TikTok, or Instagram in the last few years, you already know exactly what I'm talking about. Glass block is back as a genuinely sought-after architectural feature, not as a cheap 90s default this time, but as a deliberate, often high-end design choice in contemporary renovations. Interior designers are specifically searching out curved glass block partitions, room dividers, and shower enclosures again, now marketed as retro-chic rather than dated. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It rode in on a whole wave of adjacent internet aesthetics. Vaporwave, starting in the early to mid-2000s online music and art scene, resurrected pastel pinks and teals, Memphis group-style geometric shapes, and retro-futurist imagery as a kind of ironic, nostalgic commentary on late 80s and 90s consumer culture. Then, the broader Y2K aesthetic revival took that even further into mainstream fashion and interior design, bringing back not just the colors, but the actual materials: chunky, curved furniture, bubble shapes, translucent plastics that look suspiciously like glass block's plastic cousin. And underneath the internet trend cycle, there's the same design history pattern we've been tracing this whole video. Postmodernism as a broader movement is having a serious critical and popular reappraisal right now. Architecture critics and design historians who once dismissed 80s postmodernism as a tacky embarrassment are now writing serious retrospectives on Michael Graves and the Memphis Group. Museums are mounting postmodern furniture exhibitions. What was mocked as kitsch for 2 decades is being reevaluated as a genuinely significant, historically important movement. Exactly the way plenty of the original 1930s Art Deco buildings were once considered disposable, unfashionable eyesores before Barbara Capitman convinced everyone otherwise. Which brings us back to that opening question. How did one neighborhood's very specific design language end up in houses across the entire country? And I think, having walked through all of it, the honest answer is, it was never really about Miami specifically. Miami was the spark, the hurricane-resistant material, the preservation battle, the TV show that needed a backdrop, all colliding at exactly the right moment. But the reason it spread everywhere, and the reason it's coming back everywhere now, is that this aesthetic taps into something people keep wanting, generation after generation: color, light, a little bit of fun, a little bit of optimism about the future, expressed in the actual architecture of the ordinary rooms we live our lives in. Every era eventually gets embarrassed by its own optimism, right before it starts missing it. So, is your childhood bathroom back in style? Genuinely, maybe. And if in 15 years we're all nostalgic for gray granite and greige walls, well, you heard it here first. That's just how the cycle works. If you want the deep dive on how the 2000s gray and beige everything era happened next, and trust me, that one has just as wild a backstory, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.